Good evening and welcome to today's BIC streams. Sustainable mobility, getting Bengaluru moving in cleaner and greener ways. In collaboration with the Bengaluru Mobility Summit and One India Kannada. Joining us are panelists Ashwin Mahesh, Anjali Mohan, Chetan Maini, Satya Shankaran and MV Rajeev Gowda. Before I hand over to Professor Gowda, a few quick announcements. If you're here for the first time and are not signed up to our mailing list, you can do so by visiting our website, or you can follow us on our social media channels, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. With that, welcome everyone, and over to you, Professor Gowda.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the sustainability event, which is part of our Getting Bengaluru Moving series. This series is part of an initiative. It comes under the Bengaluru Needs You initiative of the Resident India Trust in partnership with the Bangalore International Center today. And we have with us this evening a range of amazing people, people who are thinkers, doers, pioneers, people who have been involved in bringing about change and who are the ideal set of people to talk about how to get Bengaluru moving once again, but in cleaner and greener ways. The moderator for this evening's session is Ashwin Mahesh, a public problem solver, co-founder of Lithium. These are the electric cabs that you see driving around. He's also the founder of MapUnity, which provides all kinds of interesting technical solutions to urban policy challenges. We have Anjali Mohan, who is professor at the National Law School and the Takshashila Institution, and she has been involved over the last couple of decades with various master plans and city plans, and so has a very in-depth understanding of what works and what doesn't, and what gets planned for. Then, of course, we have Chetan Maini, who is Bangalore's proud pioneer of electric cars. He's the person who invented the Reva and brought it to market, and is now co-founder of Sun Mobility, which is into sustainable solar and clean energy infrastructure. And of course, pedaling and catching up with all of us is Satya Shankaran, the bicycle mayor of Bangalore, who's been, again, a pioneer in the space of pushing the bicycling agenda forward, and has recently even launched a startup called Urban Morph, which is sort of a think action consulting firm that focuses on interesting solutions to Bengaluru's urban challenges. So I'm going to hand over to Ashwin, and once again, welcoming all of you. We'll have a wide-ranging discussion on a range of topics, both related to electric and hybrid vehicles. We'll be discussing issues related to pedestrian access, to people with disabilities, and and of course, non-motorized transport and whatever else we can come up with today. And the aim is to arrive at solutions that will be possible to implement. At the end of this 5-seminar webinar series, we plan to take these sets of recommendations and to share them with possibly a senior minister, or possibly a senior government official, and hope that the ideas that are generated will be translated into action. We've already had one event with elected representatives. We've had one more with internet-enabled services with taxis, as well as those that move people, move things. The Swedish have done those. And then, of course, this is the third in the series, focused on sustainability. The next one will be on buses, and the last will be the interaction with the senior policymaker. That's it from my side. Over to you, Ashwin, and look forward to a very engaging and fruitful conversation.
Okay, thank you, Rajeev. I'm going to go through the first set of things in a particular order. And it's an interesting panel for me because I've actually worked with all of you closely in some capacity or the other. I've worked with Anjali in planning. I work with Chetan in electric vehicles, with Rajeev, you on public policy on a bunch of different things, and with Satya on his cycling and non-motorized initiatives as well. So for me, it seems like I'm bringing together conversations that I've had with very different sets of people and for the benefit of the city. And hopefully that's really the goal in all of these things. I'm going to start in a particular way, and I'm going to start with Anjali. And Anjali, I'm going to pose the question to you that we have discussed a lot in the past. And let's have a 5-minute conversation here between the two of us to address this question of a lot of the things that we think of as mobility problems, traffic problems, transport problems. They're not really traffic or transport problems, are they? They are problems of housing and problems of not locating employment properly and not thinking about the shape and the form of the city properly. And I've been on the B-Track steering committee for many years, and the police would always say to me, sir, BDA, BBMP, BESCOM, BWSSB, ಇವರೆಲ್ಲ ಕೆಲಸ ಬಿಟ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು finally they expect the traffic police to manage everything on the street. The reality is that these problems should not even exist as mobility problems. Let's start with that.
Yes, I am in complete agreement with you that a lot of the chaos that we see and which we say are mobility issues are in fact not mobility issues per se, but rather are a manifestation of the form and function of the city, right? So whatever that form and function may be of the city. And in some sense, these mobility challenges have emerged because, as you rightly said, we have not given enough thought to how the city is growing in various segments, how these segments or these spaces that the city is expanding into, how these are speaking to each other, if at all they are, and what are the various functions that these various patterns of the city, what are the these various geographies, sub-geographies in the city are performing vis-a-vis the city as well as with each other. So I think there has not been enough, or at least it's not been operationalized in the way that it was envisaged, whether through the master plan or any other policy instrument. Now, why that has not happened is another issue, but essentially what you're saying is bang on, that these are not mobility problems, rather they manifest, they seem to be mobility problems, but are embedded in other issues that the city is facing.
Okay, so the question I was asking is, you were part of the master planning process in the last couple of years. So if one set of people are neglecting to do what they need to, and this becomes a mobility problem, why are they neglecting to do this? What is stopping the BDA or various planning authorities from actually paying attention to these things? I mean, I have some thoughts on this, but the question that I'm asking is, for the longest time, people would say, oh, Bangalore has grown so fast that before we could realize it, so many things had changed. But I don't see how that could be true. Every electricity connection is given by BESCOM only. Every building comes up in front of the BBMP engineers only. It cannot be that they don't know how the city is growing. Clearly, the private companies that are serving this market know how the city is growing. Is there a basic data problem of saying, we know how the city is growing?
Actually, so there is so I will take a step back, and I will go back to, I would like to reframe this to say that the city is not growing as it was anticipated to grow, right? So the city is growing in so many ways. What the form that the city is taking, or the function that particular form performs, is very different from what was anticipated. And because I'm a planner, I will take the planning lens over here, and there are various lenses one can take to explain how the city is functioning. But from a planner's lens, there is a huge problem in the way this planning is happening, right? And then it's not that we come to an end with our problems there. I would really go back to what I was saying was that first there is a problem in the way we are planning our city. cities. Bangalore is not an exception to it. It is also about the operationalizing of that plan. How effective is the implementation of that plan? Howsoever faulty it may be in some aspects, there is some sort of a vision to the city. There is some sort of a, one is looking, it is a futuristic planning that one is looking at. So we are not able to operationalize the way we had anticipated it. And because there is a gap between what was anticipated to what is actually unfolding on the ground, that is why there is an issue. Now, if we were to really understand as to why the problem is with the planning itself, I think it's also because the way, as I said, the way we are planning, it's largely a single agency function. Now, in very, very practical terms, can you imagine the city having a very singular understanding or a very singular framing? It is not possible, right? You need a BESCOM, you need a BWSSB, you need all the various services, you need health, education, everything else that the city has to offer. Now, can one agency have that perspective and be able to translate that perspective in a 2-dimension or a 3-dimension, which is referred to as a plan? And so therefore the problem is that we are looking at one singular stakeholder, and we've just put that stakeholder onto a pedestal saying you're capable of planning for this for this complexity that a city showcases, right? Now that there is very little conversation between the various stakeholders who actually run the city to those who plan the city. And that's where the problem lies.
Now, it is a kind of a brutal question. You've seen the people inside some of these planning spaces too. Can they really plan? Are they capable of it?
Well, let me, the thing is, yes, I have seen people inside these planning spaces, and right now it is not whether they are able to plan, you don't have sufficient people to begin with. The question of capacity comes the second to that. First, we don't have enough people. And one of the reasons why people like me are involved in these exercises is because underlying assumption is that there is either not sufficient numbers and there is neither sufficient capacity to deal with. And I use the word complexity because the city is a very complex geography.
Okay, so I'm going to switch for half a question to Rajeev Gowda before I move on to others. So Rajeev, you are from the political class, as it were. Why is it that for decades together, our state capacity has simply not been built at all? And I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but your party has been in. So there must be something that's keeping them.
Let me put it what more. Basically there has been tremendous capacity, but that capacity has been directed towards other goals, not necessarily towards a longer term public sort of development of the city, but political economic agendas which have been focused on what you might call extraction. And so there's been less attention paid to so for example, even if you were to think about how the city grows, there have been certain regulations that allow for the outskirts of the city to be to grow in manners where the approvals are by by entities that are not necessarily involved with the planning process. And so later on, the planning process comes in and has to retrofit, has to come up with roads and other services, utilities for, let's say, revenue layouts that have already been built by entrepreneurs. And so, and see, entrepreneurship is a very valuable thing, but, in this context, we want to balance people's desire to add value, but to the public interest, which is about ensuring that whatever rules and regulations allow people to do, entrepreneurs to do, also fits in with a set of constraints that allows the city to grow in a manner that's, that's amenable to even sustainable transport, cycling in Bangalore city. And there are large numbers of people, in certain socioeconomic classes who would welcome the opportunity to be able to get around on bicycles. It's just there's not enough possible, there's not enough safety. There's, concerns about that. And so these could all have been, anticipated and integrated with city plans, with road traffic agendas. Instead, we've been favoring motorized cars and and two-wheelers, and that's also because the bulk of the people who influence outcomes are driving these motorized options. Then some of these, of course, have to do with larger agendas related to peripheral ring roads and ring roads, which just take forever to come into play. And even the alternatives, the metros and the suburban rails. I've been working on suburban rail, advocating it for more than a decade now. And even as in 6 years in the Rajya Sabha as an MP, we were able to move things only a certain distance. It's still not a reality. So the system has its own sclerotic ways of dealing with things. It's very hard to push things, and that's where political will, political vision, the desire of a person to stand up and say, "I'm going to change the shape of how the city evolves," and take credit for it. Something like that would probably be helpful. But the one chief minister who played a very active role in the late 90s and early 2000s, essentially was defeated in the next election, and then there was this hesitation to identify too much with urban issues when the bulk of the MLAs are elected elsewhere in the state. So I think there are lots of complicated forces that are interacting, but basically it's not state capacity, it's not ability, it's just how they are possibly perversely applied than publicly focused.
I want to pick up on this last thing that you said, that the majority of the MLAs are from the countryside and the urban MLA representation is relatively small compared to the share of the urban population in particular. This is the result of many past things that have happened. But in 2026, that is about to change. And at that point, suddenly you could find that 50% of the legislature, the state assembly, is from urban areas, because we'll have by then 50% of the population will be urban at that point. Do you anticipate that the politics is even alert to all this change that is coming? And do people realize in politics that urban areas are the future, or are we still thinking that India lives in its villages?
No, I think we're very much aware that urbanization is happening not just in megacities like Bengaluru, but in every district and taluk headquarter. And when we campaign in the cities, we look at an apartment complex and say, these are the new villages, right? And it's actually sometimes hard to go in and campaign in them. But the point is that, but this is still, an opportunity for us to prevent things from getting out of control. Every taluk headquarter, every district headquarter that is urbanizing in an unsustainable manner, in a manner that doesn't pay attention to ecosystems or to the issues that we're discussing here today, which is sustainable mobility. Trying to get people around in a way that is, costless to themselves and to the environment. And there's not enough attention to that. And certainly, whatever planning we may or may not be doing for Bengaluru city, nothing, not even a fraction of that is at the moment being contemplated for or implemented for the other urbanizing parts of Bengaluru and the rest of India for that matter. And that's where I think all of us bringing these issues to center stage will really make a difference. And there's a lot that we have to do. I think the political class is very aware of what changes are happening, and and therefore you're going to see some positive action in the years to come?
Well, often, in government, people try to solve problems by throwing money at the problem and thinking that expenditure is going to result in certain kinds of outcomes. But even, if you look at that, they seem to be throwing money at all the wrong parts of the problem. It's been apparent for many years that buses are important, walking is important, because more than half the people in the city take buses and walk. Whereas 90% of the expenditure that we have is for movement there is a lot of political capital from just spending money correctly, and which could even benefit the decision makers. And despite the fact that there seems to be political capital in it, if you made the city more walkable, or if you doubled the bus fleet, wouldn't that create 3 million more people who would vote for you?
Yes, indeed. But, there's always this challenge of balancing private interests with public good. And, the people who are, traveling on buses, for example, or, Volvo AC buses exempted, are people who are more concerned about other aspects of life and livelihood than necessarily about issues to whether they're able to get from one place to another in an accessible, affordable, quick, and efficient manner. And that's a consciousness that we need to bring in. And I would personally say that there are enough elected representatives from the corporator to the MLA to even the MPs who are concerned about their report cards, about how they're written about when elections are due. And therefore, I think that we are moving closer to a convergence of interests between, between public good and private, private agendas. And there will always be some scope for, the need for recurrent expenditure because, that helps, keep things well oiled. If I were to, speak a little metaphorically, yeah.
Well, literally, maybe more correct than metaphorically. But just on that thought, one of the criticisms that we hear a lot is that central politicians don't want the states to do anything. State politicians don't want local bodies to do anything. If I talk to my local corporator, he always says, "Sir, MLA the bidalla, MP the bidalla." He's actually criticizing his other levels of government. You've been a central politician, so now should I think that are central politicians part of the problem, or are they part of the solution?
See, as a central politician, a member of parliament, I focused on issues that were relevant to my domain. So that's why we were trying suburban rail, which essentially involved, railways, which is a central subject, and the state government, which we needed the cooperation of. And that's the sort of thing that's absolutely in the domain of an MP. But the streets and the transport systems, etc., are very much the domain of the state legislature and then the Bengaluru Mahanagara. And I would not agree with anyone who says that I objected or obstructed anything, but maybe that's an easy excuse because things don't move fast enough. And of course, at the levels where there's direct involvement. See, I was in the Rajya Sabha, so I didn't have the same constituency responsibility, overlapping constituency responsibility as an MP and an MLA and a corporator would have, where they would each be probably vying for resolution of certain problems, the credit for resolving them, and things like that. And maybe wanting to ensure that some people that they favor would be the implementers of choice and the contractors of choice. So there's a little bit more of a complication there. But anyone who says that the city is not being favored would be barking up the wrong tree, because actually there's a lot of money that comes in from central funds and state devolved funds and various JNNURM, and you have Nagar Thana funds and things like that. So there is actually, the cities are awash with funds, and then you have this these other Amrit and other kinds of initiatives that Modi Sarkar has come up with. So there is more than sufficient resource. Is it being harnessed right? And is it, focused on the kinds of issues that we're talking about, which are so vital, essentially sustainable mobility solutions in every sense of that term?
Okay, I'm going to go to Satya next. And Satya, if you could turn your video on, and I'm going to request Rajeev, if you could mute your mic. Anjali, if you could also turn your video off, that might help us. Satya, can you turn your video on?
I am on. There's a lag.
There you are. Sorry, you're off my scroll a little bit. So I'm going to come to you with the same question. And I see how you are struggling with a post-problem problem, as it were, that it's almost like all the mistakes happen. And then we're trying to say, what should we do about non-motorized transport? How should the cycling be enabled? And how should walking be enabled? And all of that stuff. And I remember asking at the time of the budget 2-3 years ago, why is it that you're willing to give, thousands of crores to metro, hundreds of crores each year in BBMP to road building, but not even a few crores each year to do cycling, or a few tens of crores each year to do proper walking? Most of the pedestrian stuff that is built isn't really walkable. Do you feel like they have already made a decision to fund things in a certain way, and by that decision itself, the problem is more or less certain to emerge from that?
Well, I agree partly, but every other country has made the same mistake. They've gone down the wrong path of funding certain other set of investments and then figuring out that cycling has its place. If not in large numbers, it has its place in each country. So every country has gone through that path, and we are seeing a resurgence now in certain countries as to why cycling is an effective option for certain trips that you can make. And in that, we need to look at how do we fund certain amount of things. So there are two aspects of it. One is the public infrastructure that needs to be funded in the right way. And those monies have gone into motor vehicle for a long time. And if it needs to come back into non-motorized transport, we have to look at how does the political economy justify that investment? It's very important to note that, because that comes back to how people look at cycling at all. We talk about these macro issues of how the city is planned. Yeah, transportation is a derived demand. So all the problems that we create has a fallback on, if there is huge sprawl, you can't obviously have a lot of cycling happening. So it has, all of these things have interrelated effects, as you've discussed. But coming to allocating monies towards cycling, I find that now is a good enough window of opportunity to do, because it is becoming popular across the world. There is a story to be told, and how that also had to come on. The behavioral change also had to come on. There has to be a story and a window of opportunity that we can grab. And fortunately, it has come across.
I want to pause you for a second and ask us, is it fair to say that the typical expenditure on cycling in a given year in the city by the government at different levels is not even equal to the cost of building one road?
It is not, and everybody knows that. And it is very easy to see that the cost of investing in bicycling is very, very small, and the benefits that it can accrue is very large. There is no doubt about that. The question is, why aren't they doing it, and how do we get them to do it? These are the only two questions I've been trying to answer. And part of the problem is coming back to the what is popular now in terms of, there's so much of fight just to get public transport, which is far more acceptable and accessible to more people. So if you look at a public transport mode share, it should be far, at least 5 times larger than a non-motorized vehicle mode share. That itself is becoming a fight. That it's because we have a trajectory of investments in motor vehicle infrastructure, which has gone on for long, at least not as long as the other countries. We've only had it for 40 years now. It is possible to turn back, and we are finding those reasons. When is that point that we need to pivot and say more money needs to come? Who are the people who are going to do that? Are they in power now? Do they see that? Is cycling popular enough for them to say that there is a political economy around doing something? And right now is a good window of opportunity. So COVID actually is a blessing in disguise to see how we can maximize this. I see no other answer other than a hard slog of making people, a lot of it also comes down to, Ashwin, you and I know, is acceptability of cycling as a mode. There are hundreds of concerns people will place on the table as to why I will not be able to cycle. And one of which is the leaning towards a motor vehicle based economy and how the infrastructure is evolving around us. It's a chicken and egg. Most people would say, don't build a bridge trying to count the number of people swimming across the river. You still need to build infrastructure and they will come. On the other hand, I also feel there should be a parallel effort in people actually choosing the mode for certain trips and making it count so that we can allocate a certain amount of reasoning to making those budget provisions.
Do you think all of this will just flow naturally if there's a budget? For example, if the next BBMP budget simply said 20 crores for cycling or 30 crores for cycling, or the next state budget said 150 crores for cycling in Bengaluru, do you think, the money will make the initiatives flow?
Definitely.
Is that, should we go to the finance department or the chief minister or the mayor and say, look, reduce it to only this, make this allocation?
We've talked about this before. There is a lot of that can be done, but it's also important to know where this money is going. 20% of Bangalore, if you look at the 2,000 kilometers of arterial roads that are available, that's out of the 736 square kilometers, 12,000, 13,000 kilometers of road, right? Which is around 18 to 20% of Bangalore has 15 meters or wider, which means you can get dedicated cycle tracks on 20% of Bangalore. What happens to the rest of Bangalore on the 80% where we all live on the local streets and collector streets? We are not going to get a cycle lane there. How do you do traffic calming? Where does the money get spent on? These 2,000 kilometers at 200 kilometers a year, you will spend the next 10 years building cycle tracks for just 20% of Bangalore. And this is only talking about 736 square kilometers, not even the CMP 1600 kilometer area. So the mathematics says that when you put in this money, first thing is to, like you said, put the money on the table and say, let's spend on cycling. It doesn't cost much. The second thing is too many people are asking, why are you spending on cycling? What are you spending on is important. If you look at the government only as an infrastructure spender, then they are only going to take care of 2,000 kilometers. How do we then look at alternate ways of traffic calming streets, making streets friendly for cycling, lake connectors that you have talked about and others have talked about? How do you get out of the box ideas of making people get on a bicycle? And that's the harder problem to solve because there are aspirational goals, there are concerns, all other things that are attached to it. It's a very complex problem, but money has to be put without people asking questions. Where are you going to put the lane?
So, I know you're the bicycle mayor, but I want you to speak more broadly about, let's call you for the moment the non-car mayor or the non-motorized mayor, and say, look, it's all related, isn't it? It's cycling and pedestrianization and buses and metro all seen together as one single piece. It's really, in some ways, it's like equity and fairness in how much of a road is given to people of different types of users. And I've said in BBMP, for example, that when we have a road, we first give the space to the car and the motorized vehicle and then ask what is left for everybody else. And sometimes nothing is left for everybody else. Could we just invert that to say on every street, the first use of space must be for those who walk and cycle?
And everybody inside BBMP and other government entities also know that, and everybody speaks about that in all of the conferences, but it's very hard for them to internalize and do it on the road. So when they build a road and allocate budgets, even today, unless it is a tender sure road, all of the roads are only for asphalt and drains. You know that footpaths today have 5 times more utilities than the road itself has. The road might have a manhole and a sewage, but this one has trees, it has electricity, cabling, you have street furniture. There are 5 times more budget needs to be put on a footpath and a cycle track. People still do not see the taking away of just 1.5 meters and 2.5 meters seems to cause so much consternation among people that the political class is not willing to invert that pyramid. How do we get the people to not revolt if we gave a footpath and a cycle track? Why is that a hard thing for us as collective to do that? And my messaging has always been about that. Why can't you normalize the fact that if somebody talks about inverting a pyramid, you don't jump up and scream? That's the first thing you shouldn't. And it's not going to come from acquisition. It has to come from existing road space. You need to cannibalize some amount of road space. And it's just a lane. It's 3 meters for both walking and cycling together.
In every neighborhood, there are enough stretches where this can be done without too much difficulty, even today. You know, I mean, we've gone walking around on streets in JP Nagar and Jayanagar and said, you know, this portion could be easily made pedestrian or cycled. Yeah, there's lots of space like that. So, you know, I'm going to take a segue from this back to Rajeev and pose one question to you, Rajeev. There are two takeaways from, you know, what Satya and before that, you know, Anjali have both said. Can we push for a better budget for the things that really matter to a lot of people in the coming budgets of BBMP and the state government? Can we push for larger budgets for the things that really have? We create a program where communities can say, we'd like the following streets to be pedestrianized or non-motorized, and, you know, let communities pick 100 streets across the city that they turn into something other than streets for cars. Rajeev, could things like that be goals from today's discussion?
I would expect so, Ashwin, because you know, I have been involved in manifestos of the Congress Party at the you know, BBMP level as well as at the national level, and we're constantly looking for tangible ideas that we can translate into actual policy. And so I would think that if we were able to get you know, a set of concrete policies like this, which say this is what we're going to do and this is our vision for how Bengaluru will move, and this is the amount of money that's actually required, I think, you know, that level of tangible or, you know, sort of ideation will be something that the political class would happily embrace. At least that is something that I would advocate within my party. And I mean, I do think that there are other political parties that would want to jump on ideas like this. So this is something that we must take forward beyond this conversation.
Well, you're also from a national party. So let me put the question to you in a slightly more expansive way. If it can't be done here because you're not in power here, can you get this done in Jaipur?
You know, there's a historic link. After all, Mirza Ismail helped you know, design Mysore and Jaipur. So there's no reason why people from here can't take their ideas there. I'm, you know, we'll see. These are all, you know, basically. I am on I'm on the, yeah, go ahead. These are ideas that can be cross-fertilized across states, and
not only that,
it's worth exploring.
I think the examples have multiplier value. I think that's really the thing. We'll come to that. I want to ask one more question, which is a segue into what I want to ask Chetan next. But before I go to Chetan, Rajeev, one question for you. And Satya seems to sort of hint at this thing, which is, and Anjali said this too, that essentially there is a set of that they're not going to make money, right? A public bicycle sharing scheme is simply not viable without state support. Public transport is not really viable without state support. The idea or that a bicycle scheme should make money, it's been around for a long time. The BMTC, in fact, for many years was proud of the fact that they made money. And it was, you know, every transport professional would hear that and say, oh my God, this is like the absolute wrong thing to be proud of, because the way they make money, the way they are profitable is that they don't run any of the routes that are not profitable, right? So that's not a way to be profitable. So in a way, where does this thing come from that certain kinds of choices need to be viable when in fact the subsidy for roads is so high on a per capita basis?
Well, I think a lot of this is not visible to the public. The kinds of you know, allocations and the subsidies are not necessarily explicit. you actually go around telling people we are widening your road, we are, what's white topping it, things like that. All of these things are actually the things that you are proud of, saying this is, and that's how, and the local public says, yes, you've done a great job. So, so there's, I think, scope for much more articulation of the complexities of the hidden trade-offs involved. And that's something that all of you, I mean, Bangalore civil society has been amazing that way at bringing up, a lot more awareness than existed pre-2000, right? I mean, this last couple of decades has been amazing in terms of civic engagement, transformation across domains. And so I think it's a work in progress, and we'll continue in that direction.
Okay, so that now brings me to Chetan. Chetan, if you could turn your video on.
Yeah.
Let me put it sort of brutally, and maybe I should ask myself this question too, partly. What's the problem we're trying to solve, right? At one level, it seems like motorized vehicles are the problem, but there's a parallel narrative that is emerging, that electric problem over the thing. And people have said often that, if you replace 1 million non-electric vehicles with 1 million electric vehicles, you might have very many of the same problems that the city now has. So, my own sense of it is a little more nuanced than electric, but, I'll let you go first to say, what's the problem you're trying to solve?
Well, I think that, I don't know about you, but the last, 60, 90 days in lockdown, it seemed like we had old Bangalore. I saw fireflies in my garden. I've seen parrots around here and, bluer skies. And that's the kind of Bangalore we grew up in. I cycle to school every day and would love to have my kids cycle. And that's something that Sathya and hope we can work out. But I think the way at which we're growing is so fast that the growth has to be in a sustainable manner. So the first thing is that we've got to get rid of local pollution to get the pollution part controlled. And there, I think electrification plays a large role, because at a local level, we go to zero pollution. Even more relevant because vehicles, even with newer emission norms, are good today. But 5 years down the line, 7 years down the line, because of poor maintenance, emissions go up to 2 to 3 times more. So in real world, we have to close on the emissions side. The stop and go driving is making life even worse. Which is very different from maybe 20 years ago. So the same vehicle is polluting a lot more. So first we got to fix that. But then we got to also address the entire congestion side. And there I think the way we think about shared mobility and the way we think about integration of making it more efficient use of vehicles, right? So if the same vehicle in shared can replace 5 vehicles on this area, if there's a cross-utilization of vehicles being used for delivery and passenger, because throughout the day we need that, then we can start to reduce the amount of pollution, reduce the amount of congestion too, also on the road. And the third is we're not, even if we just think of effective utilization of technology, if we really know, that 50,000 people move from one place to Whitefield every day, we really know in real time how to use the data, we can just probably reduce congestion by 20% by just optimizing things. So I think it's not that electrics would be a very important part, because we will still have motorized transportation as part of cities, and that's going to be an essential part of it. But if we are able to focus to integrate it with the other aspects, and electrics have an opportunity that telematics and connectivity can come in. There's an opportunity to put things around a platform for a city that can integrate these resources. And I think there's also a new set of new forms of transportation, new forms of solutions coming in cities, where from day one, they can go electric, right? So if I think of fleets, if I think of first mile, last mile, there's no reason why from day one they can't go in. And if we start to give consumers an end-to-end experience of electric, they will move towards that. And that means if the guy comes from a metro, which is electric, and then goes 2 kilometers to his work, which is also electric transportation, right? And the whole journey is electric end to end, but also connected. Then you're helping probably solve much more than just one problem for a city. And I think that's an opportunity that we have in Bangalore to do right and really make a huge impact.
Sure. I mean, the way I sort of talk about it is to say that what vehicles, and if we can keep increasing the number of electric kilometers that each vehicle does, then we're starting to get value out of going electric. But I want to come back to something that you quickly passed over, because this could be something else that Rajeev can take forward. You said, you know, this distinction between vehicles that are for cargo and vehicles that are not for cargo or for persons is a little bit of a, in my view, it's actually an unnecessary line for a lot of things. But I think historically, the regulatory environment and the registration environment for vehicles has made a strong distinction between what is a cargo vehicle and what is not a cargo vehicle. Could you could blur that? There's no reason why, for example, a courier could not be delivered by a cargo vehicle or a non-cargo vehicle. And scooters, for example, are doing both kinds of deliveries now. This definitions of vehicles, I suspect, are going to change in the future. And what is it that we could go to the government and say, think about these definitions and think about why these differences are needed anymore?
I think it's a very simple one. You know, we've been working with the government for a while on getting green plates for electrics, and that's finally been implemented. So
I am the first one, by the way.
Yes. So you have white and black and white, you have a host of colors depending if it is what application it is. Maybe there's a possibility, which would be an easy thing to say, listen, if you have a green plate, which is anyway electric, there's no boundaries on usage on this area. It could be for commercial or personal. It could be for load or for passenger. And as a result of this, because of such a simple implementation, and you can get more utilization now, it could be very meaningful. So someone could be for 4 hours, put their own bike on a bike share platform and have others use it, or have someone delivering pizzas at one point, or even look at it as a bike taxi at another portion, or use it for personal on a weekend if he wants to do it. That would really help in a simple way. And I think this can be done easily with the new green plate. It was difficult earlier. So it could be done both from at a central government level and then deployed at a state level. And this is something that I believe can help the industry. In post-COVID times, the biggest part for us is going to be utilization rates, right? Everyone is really going to struggle. Things like this can help us on the right path and a simple solution to the problem of multi-use of vehicles.
You know, of late, I really think of you as the energy guy more than the vehicles guy. And that's for a reason, because of all the things that you've been telling me. Talk to all of us about energy. That is really, I think, unlike petroleum or diesel, electricity is something that everybody has in their house. And it's there in every building. In fact, I always say the world's largest charging infrastructure already exists. It's just facing inward. If you make it face outward from every building, you'll just have what you need to have. But I think this has implications. I saw your thing with IOC, was it? IOCL recently. And I was wondering, is public charging infrastructure, does that make sense? Is that ever going to make money? Is that, why? I have electricity in my house. Why should I go to a charging infrastructure point to get electricity?
Yeah, so I think that having been on EVs for 25 years, I felt that there have been three key challenges, that the cost of electrics was very high. People were really concerned with range anxiety if they run out of charge. And people weren't happy with the long refueling time of 4 to 6 hours for regular charge and maybe an hour for fast charge. And I felt that unless you address these issues at scale, you won't have deployment. The second big part was to look at 2- and 3-wheelers and buses, which really constitute 85% of the transportation in India, and also 85% of the pollution being created and the miles being driven on this front. So the idea is, if we focused on, let's take for a second 2- and 3-wheelers, and then we get to buses, can there be a common solution like an Android approach across all platforms, that by separating the batteries from the vehicles, you can now get vehicles to be as cost effective as internal combustion engine vehicles? And if you can swap them in a couple of minutes, then you address both the range anxiety and long refueling time. And now if a person is going electric, they don't care, because when someone buys an electric, they want to make sure that they're using it for the corner cases. What if that weekend I had to drop my wife off, then my kid, then do my other extra journey, and on my scooter, which I may want to do over 100 kilometers, and that may not be possible without a charge. And so I felt that the swapping solution would be right. And this means that a city has to come together, and players, right? It's all about how do you create common of an infrastructure that 10 fleet providers can use, 10 OEMs can use. It can be easy as to access as a petrol bunk. And so therefore, we've today tied up with an IOCL where we can put stations in there, tie up with the city's electricity company to see how we can integrate it. So if infrastructure comes in, always a chicken and egg thing, but if infrastructure comes in, it makes a big difference. Bangalore has 85 LPG bunks, and it took the city probably 10 to 15 years to put that together on this front. You could put up 100 swapping stations in 6 months in the city to replicate that, which means all of a sudden a consumer is not concerned that they would run out of charge and go in there. So I think that the infrastructure has a large play to get wide scale adoption, especially on the 2 and 3 wheeler side. I'm not looking as much as a personal transportation, but definitely on the shared front. And that's why I think there can be a large role of infrastructure. While someone does 30, 40 kilometers, he can go home and plug in. But think of it at scale. What do you do for 200,000 auto drivers? Do they have the infrastructure? What do you do about the delivery boys? What do you have to do about a lot of people who may not have the infrastructure to charge and want to go electric? That's what I see a large scope for simplified, open architecture, interoperable platforms.
Also, Anjali, I want to come back to you on something that Chetan just now said, that when we first began planning the city many decades ago through the planning agencies, one of the things that sort of everybody took for granted was that rich people would have cars. But we increasingly, through the shared economy, have a situation where very large numbers of people now use the car as the means to their livelihood. They may not be wealthy enough to own a car for themselves, but the car is their instrument of a livelihood, right? And they don't live in houses with parking lots and things like that, right? They don't really have the space for the cars in their houses. Is this kind of emerging new direction in mobility? How do you capture this back in the planning space?
It's possible to capture that within the planning space. Even the planning vocabulary, I would say, has matured, at least at the policy level, where there is the need for a mobility plan to be brought in. And this has to be plugged into the land use plan. Actually, the mobility plan brings in mobility and land use together. That it hasn't been done is a different question, but there are policy directives which give us that space to be able to bridge this and bring it into the plan. But how effectively we are doing it, or whether we are doing it or not, is a different question. We are not. At this point in time, especially for Bangalore city, this has not been attempted or has been attempted. Unfortunately, once the whole plan, the land use plan came out, and then there was a thought about a mobility plan. So it's an afterthought. But if you look at the policy directive, there is a means that provides the bridge to bring it in and account for these things within the larger plan, the statutory document.
And you think they can actually do this in the current? I mean, one of the other things that I will, maybe we've spoken about this before.
I can't hear you, Ashwin.
In India, throughout the country, anybody who owns a piece of land,
Ashwin, sorry, you'll have
go to the government and say, I want to build on it.
Ashwin,
this is actually not that common. That people around the world, okay, is it interconnected?
Yes, you'll have to repeat that question entirely.
Can you hear me
because
now?
we didn't hear any of it. Yes. Yeah, you're audible now.
Okay, so my question was, You know, in India, anybody who owns some land can go to the government and say, I want to build on it.
Yeah.
That kind of seems odd that, you know, this is not the way people actually build elsewhere in the world. Elsewhere in the world, the carrying capacity of a region or a neighborhood is assessed, and permission to build is restricted to those areas. It seems like we are getting applications from all over the place. One from the northeast, the next one from the southwest, one for a giant community, one for a really small house. There is no order to any of these kinds of things, that we get, you know, applications from each of very different places, and we just respond to each application in a very technical way. We don't even look at the overall picture. We go and create communities where water is scarce and, you know, other resources are scarce, and we ignore places where water and other things are more abundantly available. Is it time to say, just because you own some land doesn't mean you have the right to build on it?
I would say, I would differ a little bit. Perhaps we will get into other issues if we say don't have the right to build on it. But I would say that that right to build has to be steered in line with the larger vision or the larger thought of how the city should grow. And that thought itself has to be very clear. Right? Where do you want the city to go? How do you want the city to go? And right now, that visioning itself is so divorced from what people are thinking at the ground level. So there is no bridge over there. So therefore, as somebody has also asked in one of the questions, no, that the city, is there a vision for the city? There is a vision for the city. However, whether that vision is by the city, we don't know. It is definitely not. If you ask me my personal opinion, no, that vision has not been constructed by the city. To get back to your question, yes, actually you could frame it differently to say that if you have a parcel of land, instead of saying you have the right to do it, but that right is tempered and steered within a larger understanding of how the city should grow or how that particular neighborhood should grow. Forget the city. The city will incrementally, the neighborhood will add to the city, but at least there should be one vision for the neighborhood itself, you know, and how it's meant to grow.
This brings me to one more thing, Rajeev, that, you know, one could take away from a conversation like this. Let's say that, you know, 3 lakh people move to the city each year, and that's roughly correct. I think 300,000 people have been moving to the city each year for the last several years, which means that we need to have about 75,000 new building plan approvals of some housing unit approvals. But there is a distribution to this. Really what you need is about 10,000 units for people who are well off, about 35,000 units for people who are middle income, and another 30,000 units for people who are low income. This is what you need. But the applications for building plans are all coming from rich people.
Okay, so basically, I would also add that you also need affordable rental housing for migrant populations as well, migrant workers. We've seen that, you know, very starkly during this lockdown. Now, a lot of construction happens without permission, so that's probably why people are, you know, in certain socioeconomic categories are not applying as much. But more than anything else, the planning arrangement right now is, you know, smaller sites rather than for denser constructions, and there's a lot of change that's required out there, and that change has to fit in with this larger planning process of you know, being able to work and live close to one another in such a manner that you don't need, you know, today in Bengaluru, the majority of trips are for work or for education, and they crisscross the city and they go right through the city. And so many of these things will change if we change the nature of what kind of buildings do we want to allow, and whether we want to keep expanding in 20, 30 sites, you know, in sort of a sprawl, or whether we want to bring people together in more denser concentrations with access to work, access to utilities of various kinds, parks, sports facilities, and you know, other kinds of amenities, and bicycle lanes and electric vehicle infrastructure.
Yeah. Sathya may have reordered that sentence a little bit and, you know, put the bicycles in before your and then
there you go.
After your and. But you know, my question was really to go towards, and really, Sathya, you know, stay online, Sathya, because really I think this is the question to ask, that it's because you don't provision for the housing for the lower income groups and the middle income groups that you're not provisioning for their mobility either. That if you sort of began by thinking, so for example, one could say that out of 75,000 building plans that are approved in the next year, 18 months, whatever, there has to be a ratio that there is, you just cannot give away land that is meant for a wider set of people to use for rental or non-rental housing. If you just give it away to people who can own it instead, it puts tremendous price pressure for everybody else. It costs more than 70 lakh rupees to buy a single 30-40 site and build a small house on it today. How many people have 70 lakhs? Our whole planning regime seems to be for the top 3 or 4% of the population. You know, Satya, I really want to, you've sort of worked a lot in one neighborhood in Sanjay Nagar in particular, trying to say all these problems that show up on the city, on the street, the walking problem and the cycling problem and the vendors who need to make a livelihood and all of these kinds of things that are clashing on the street. Really, all of these clashes are about where people live as much as they are about where they work and how they get to those places, right? What is so difficult about saying, I mean, even last week, BDA was auctioning 300 corner plots. Frankly, you shouldn't be auctioning corner plots. But BDA thinks there's lots of money in corner plots and they go actually auction them. That money is very much lesser than the price that the city pays for making that mistake.
No, I agree with the thing. I don't want to conflate the aspirational goals and the planning issue that we have. Again, going back to saying that transportation is a derived demand, it is important to have built it right, but not having built it right, we also have a correction in the name of transit-oriented development, which we can do, which is try to reconstitute areas to run it around transit, because when we gave permissions or when we planned it, we couldn't plan it properly. So there is an allowance, I think, in planning also to have certain amount of organic way of developing things. But what happens is, again, going back to density and sprawl and all those things, that's something you and Anjali can talk more about. But what I'm saying now is there is an aspirational issue even among the middle class or the lower middle class. If I spoke to the gardener who I went and asked and said, I'll give you a bicycle lane, I'll keep you for, I'll give you all these facilities to keep you safe. He said, fine, I'll take it. But from your questioning, it appears that you want me to stick to a cycle. The only reason I go and earn and get a nice job is to get a motor vehicle and upgrade myself. So the aspirational goals that we have set is coming back and saying, you are the guys who set these aspirational goals. Why are you coming and telling me not to follow them? Why aren't you giving up any of these things, or at least making certain trips to set a standard to say, I'm not going to use this for these trips. I'm going to use the motor vehicle for certain other trips. We all seem to think in binaries. Most people, I go and tell them, get a bicycle and ride it. They say, oh, you want to dispossess me of my car. That's the binaries they think in. They're not thinking of percentages, saying that I can do 20% of my trip on a bicycle. I'm not asking you to go to Chennai on a car, but I'm just saying, why don't you use this for your neighborhood or your commute? So working on attitudes is a bigger problem for me than actually allocating money. We talk, if there is money out there, but it's not within the window of acceptability or popularity for the political economy. That's where they're saying, you guys need to shift this window. It's not up to us. So most of the time I'm working on saying, what is your ability to take up a bicycle and give it a shot? More people are doing it. How do we get that? And a lot of it is around behavioral. And this is why I was looking at Vision 1 Crore. So you talked about the problems with unit profitability and public bicycle sharing. It is true. And the reason is micromobility suffers from not being able to empathize with that form factor. There is no acceptability of that form factor. None of us, a lot of people who are being shuffled around or have been in cars, they might easily prefer a rental shared car rather than getting onto a shared bicycle, because there is fear of riding, there's fear of so many things, there's fear of not being able to maneuver that small little thing in traffic. So ownership is something I'm again going back to and saying ownership will lead to more bike rentals. We are cracking it the wrong way. It's easy for you to crack a car and a motor vehicle because you have 80 lakh motor vehicles out there and most people are familiar with it, but not with a bicycle or one of those scooties and things like that. There should be a curve of adoption happening. So my Vision 1 Crore is saying a bicycle costs less than a cell phone. There is no reason you shouldn't be owning one. The least it will do is build empathy, and you'll ride around at least when your gym is not open. We need to build empathy, and I'm saying at least 1 crore people in this city need to have a bicycle. They should be able to. I'll get them to ride it. That's the next challenge. It's a typical sales funnel. If you have 1 crore, you'll get 20 lakhs. If you have only 20 lakhs, you'll not even get 2 lakhs out on the road. So I'm trying to think of getting the acceptability, getting empathy, getting 1 crore going on the road, and then come back, and the next time I go on a metro or a bus, I'll easily pick up a micro mobility vehicle because it's right there and I'm familiar with it. I know how to use it and I won't be afraid of it. That's my angle into it. Planning, yes, but attitudes, bigger problem. Nobody wants to solve it. I would like to solve it.
Okay, I'm going to go to Chetan for one last question before we open up. Let's start looking at the audience questions. Chetan, Satya talked about empathy, and I think there's a little bit of a thing that the electric world can leverage. It seems like in the electric world, there's a little bit of empathy for the motorized vehicle too. It's kind of bizarre in some sense. People say, oh, this is a good motorized vehicle because it's an electric motorized vehicle. Whereas otherwise it seems like there is acceptance of motorized vehicle and lack of empathy for non-motorized options. And so, I have 2 questions for you, and you can take them in whatever order. One is to say, is it the responsibility of people working on motorized but sustainable solutions to also be advocates of non-motorized solutions? I mean, I know I'm sort of asking a question that doesn't come naturally to either your business or mine, but it's a fair question to ask, that if the motivation is sustainability, that we must simultaneously favor sustainable motorized, but also non-motorized options equally, and maybe even carry a cost for that. The unit economics of a cycle program are so low that to carry those unit economics within a motorized vehicle program should be fairly simple. That that it's easy for businesses like ours to say, well, give 100 rupees per month per motorized vehicle that we run simply to support a cycle program in the city. I don't see that as very difficult. So this is one thing I thought you could talk about. The other thing I'll put to you is, you've been working with a lot of governments, just telling them about their cities. This is what your city is like, and this is why, these visualizations of mobility in the city that we've looked at together as well. And this is the fuel infrastructure, and this is the corresponding electric infrastructure you will need to be able to do everything that people do in the city. Which cities are more receptive to hearing others tell them what their city is like and acting on them?
Yeah, I think that your first point is, I'm personally very for that in my personal capacity and as an organization. I think that it's important that we have to look at sustainable mobility solutions, and if they are non-motorized. And I think over time, there's something between the two where it's a hybrid area where probably you have cycles that also have small electrification that can be used on both. And so you can cover people who are a little older or would want to have some challenges can also use that. So I'm for that. And I think that if there are mechanisms in a city that says if people can support that, that'll be good. Because I don't think, as Sathya talked about it, it's not this black and white. It's going to be people will still use all forms. And if they're getting to using more sustainable forms of transportation, that would be walking, cycling, and electrics, in general, it would help the entire industry. And we're moving them to those forms. So I'm very much for that on this front. Your second point related to what cities have been looking at this and how they've been working around it. I think that there are 2 parts to that. One, I think many cities are looking at it, but often there's a gap between that vision and the implementation of this area, right? And we get stuck in this issue. So let's take Bangalore. We're talking about Bangalore here. So let's take this as an example here, right? We've been doing electrics the longest in any city in the country, right? On this area, we're the first city in the country and the first state in the country to roll out an EV policy. Again, very positive on this area. But then if someone wants to today put up infrastructure, the concessions are still not clear. If someone wants to really register a new 3-wheeler, there are still challenges that one faces on this area. if one wants to still get electric connections for this area, the cost of getting electric connections are higher than any other state in the country, right? In terms of transformer costs and stuff like this. If we start to look at, we have lower tariffs of electricity in the city, they're not fully implemented. There is a state policy that says there is a lower tariff, but it doesn't get pushed out to every nook and corner. So the first thing is that I think there's several states and several cities have taken the leadership. The ones that will be successful are going to be the ones that actually stick to the spirit and implement that on this area. We found a very positive thing in Chandigarh. We launched our three-wheelers there. Chandigarh has been very clear. Electrification is very important, so they're only giving permits to only electrics going forward on the three-wheeler side, and they want to promote it. And the city itself can do it. And now, of course, because being a smaller city and a union territory, decision-making is much faster. And that's a city that's already been planned quite well and has that planning thought process, since the 50s on this area. So you see some of that. But then you see pockets of excellence. Delhi's new EV policy was very positive, but unfortunately with all COVID and stuff, it hasn't been implemented, right? So what I'm seeing is more pieces of the puzzle, but not really a fully integrated area. And I think the first city and state that does it and creates this thought process, everyone will migrate to that. And I think that could then become a model for India. And I think we today have that opportunity in Bangalore. What we should be having a conversation is, what do all stakeholders here do to make Bangalore that model city where we already have all the starting points? We have the maximum number of OEMs here. We have all the mobility solution providers here. We have a lot of renewable energy that can come at the outskirts of Bangalore, which means we can power all our transportation on renewable. We have a lot of IT and all of technology here. We have all the pieces of the puzzle. The key is to put this together and make this as a model city and really show that to the country and the world of what can be done.
Okay, let's see if some of us can put something together that would be helpful to the city for that. So I'm going to go to some questions from the audience that are in the Q&A chat windows, and feel free, each of you, if you want to pick up on particular questions as well. I'm happy to start with one from the audience, which essentially says, look, there are and Muralidhar Rao asked this question. He's a sort of a big fan of bus reform in the city. He said, look, there are actually lots, BMTC has 6,000 buses or 7,000 buses, but privately, there are another 45,000 buses in the city. So it seems like it's not that we don't have the vehicles, it's just that the distribution of vehicles is doing things that are not necessarily for the totality of the city, that you have, subsets of the city's economy that are served in ways, and that if we sort of integrated them, you might get more to happen for more and more of this people in the city. Anjali, I'm going to come back to you with this to lead this forward, to say, are we too narrowly imagining what a part of the city, a service or an area is being used for? Is single use itself the problem? There's so many things. I mean, Chetan talked about the shared economy. There's no reason why a school playground or a school building in the evening couldn't be part of a shared society in some way. It seems like everything in our planning world is for single use by single people, single persons.
You were right, and as I said, that the whole premise of the planning in itself is faulty, and it is a single use, primary use by a primary stakeholder, and there is very little shared knowledge around the planning, but that's not how the city functions, and there is a gap over there.
Are you saying that they use it more than singly anyway? That doesn't matter if the planners are.
It does get used. We are not able to capture that within the plan and the policy.
But they're also taking risks doing that in a non-legal way, right? I mean,
yes, of course. Yes, totally. But I think there is just so much immunity that is currently there that it just goes on. The whole system works in a certain way. I would just...
Hold on a second. I don't want to miss that thing. Rajeev, this could be another point that emerges for you, that the master plan must include a fair degree of non-single use, as it were, that essentially you must look actively for things that can be used in by more than just the primary stakeholder, for more than just the primary purpose. And this is a concrete step that you could easily take in the master planning process.
I think we are at the cusp of this kind of transformation, and we've already seen the emergence of co-working, for example, similarly shared mobility. And so I think it is entirely possible that we will be looking at shared playgrounds, shared infrastructure, various other kinds. And this is a new way of looking at the world in our city. And that's very, very relevant. We also have to look at new kinds of demands. If people are going to be working from home, if there's a need for social distancing, these are all challenges and opportunities, themselves.
Ashwin, to your point on the bus side, I think that it's also important that there is clarity on policy, right? So today, because the government is also in the bus business, which is good, it needs that, the city needs it. How do you try to have private players that can actually use shared mobility at scale, right? You see buses at IT parks, and each company has their own bus. There's no reason why the same bus can't, have 5 companies taking it. But there are policy challenges where it doesn't allow you to do it, right? Similarly, can a school bus be multi-use for other applications, right? If all this information was available on a city infrastructure, and we know where transportation needs are and what times they're needed, we can use transportation as idle in an area. But that also means that that route needs permissions to do it. So there needs to be a level of a playing field if you want to really use the transportation, right? If 6,000 buses has talked to our government and 5x of that or 10x of that is not government, then the impact of the other part can be very high on the city. How can we, instead of the government investing more, create and be part of the solution and enable shared transportation to be done at scale and privatize some of it without impacting itself and creating a solution for all? So the shared concept and resource is critical. We can't add more transportation. We just have to use things more efficiently, use road space more efficiently. And that's where I believe there could be a lot of policy things could make this a real enabler.
Rajeev, this is another thing, this idea of a level, I don't want to call it a level playing field, but just, a fair and consistent approach to policy. One could ask, why should school buses be painted yellow if BMTC buses that run for schools don't need to be painted yellow? I mean, it cannot be that yellow is good because it identifies it as a school bus, but when BMTC runs it, it's not necessary for it to be yellow. That it seems like there is constantly in government a regulatory environment that says, these regulations are really private sector regulations. They're not really, when the government, there should be CCTV cameras in all schools, just not in government schools. There should be, one can go on with any number of examples. Collusion between multiple market players is cartelization. But if insurance companies owned by the government do it, that's not cartelization. So there's no, finance ministry even issued an advisory to the insurance companies saying, please cartelize. How do you overcome this thing where the government as a service provider in many sectors of the urban economy is actually exempting itself from regulation, and that's creating wrinkles in the outcomes?
See, when you think about regulation, it's always about regulating private behavior in a very substantial manner and in the public interest. And the assumption is that public entities offering the services will not suffer from any of the perverse incentives that might drive private players, cutting corners for profits or something like that. And but everything needs to be re-looked at in totality, because there should be the same rules, as you point out, should be applied to everyone. The example that you gave about public buses not being yellow, well, that's because they're only used for 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour in the evening when they ferry students back and forth. And
Are you
otherwise,
saying that student safety for that 1 hour is not important?
I think that every vehicle should be, conforming to safety norms. So that I think is not at all an issue here. I'm just, we're sort of looking at.
But you're right. You seem to be admitting that color is not one of those safety norms.
No. I don't think. I think color is a signal, but it's not the only one. Every vehicle should be, accorded the same respect, whether it's visibly carrying children or not. It could be an auto rickshaw with, overloaded than otherwise most often. Anyway, the point is the regulatory system needs massive reform. We need to raise these sorts of issues. We need to remove the barriers that would enable more players to actually help move people, move things, move them safely, and in a sustainable manner. So I think that's one of the purposes of the kind of ideation that we're having here. And we need to compile these suggestions, identify why. For example, many times these regulatory barriers are there because the public entity may not want private competition. It's already facing challenges. And, and see, take the gig economy, for example. The fact that, states have ensured that you only, taxi drivers who are registered as commercial taxi drivers can actually fly is very different from how Uber and Ola equivalents in other parts of the world operate, in terms of the gig economy.
That's going away. That's going away now.
Well, you've been going away quite a bit as well. So anyway, that's not the point. All I'm trying to say is, I'm just saying that regulations need a lot of fixing. There are certain interests which relate to protecting, existing entities and their turf. And we can, reimagine many of these regulations without compromising on sustainability, safety, efficiency, and the ability and the vision of sharing infrastructure of various kinds with many more people than they're currently shared with.
Well, we have an audience question from Nihal, and Satya, I'm going to toss this at you because Nihal says, well, is there any capacity to do all of these things in the government? Do we need to hire people from the outside and bring them in to do many of these things? And I know you've said to me many times, it's not just that people in government won't do this or that, they can't. And therefore we have to work with that also a little bit.
It's possible, but in the cycling space specifically, most of what needs to be discovered have been discovered. It is not that you can't plan a bicycle track or anything like that. There are some amount of new thinking that is required that can be proposed by people from whoever they are. They should be able to put it out there and say, how do we do that? There's traffic calming measures in different ways. There are local interventions. I think a lot of solutions in cycling. Some of it is definitely capacity. Contractors don't pick up most of the cycle lane tenders because of some cost issues or not having the technology to do pigmentations. They've all come up now. This was an excuse about 4 years ago, but it is not anymore. And expertise is available from outside. It need not necessarily be inside as well. But it's not rocket science in terms of cycling infrastructure. I think the ability to budget for it and make it a priority, which we talked about, is the first thing. The second thing is also to look at how do we then do this outreach and shift the window in a way that people start asking for it, and then the government will definitely enable it. And some of my attempts are always to come back and say, you need to show your intent by picking it up and standing up for it and saying, this is something that I am adopting. I need you to help me put that intervention that is required and help me cycle safely. So I think it cuts two ways. Yes, there is a capacity issue, but it's not all that great. It's not as great as in planning, if you ask me, or in monitoring and management and things like that. That is a far more complex issue than a specific thing for this particular. There are
Yeah, a lot
business.
of this is also about people's involvement, isn't it?
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
Anjali,
yeah,
Anjali, you wanted to take Anjali, you wanted to take the next question, which is from Anusha, and Anusha asks, why doesn't the vision go to the people? Why don't the planners take the vision to the people and to the lawmakers? And why isn't there more interaction around all of these things? I mean, you've been very close observer of this. The master planning process requires all these things, although it's never done. Why is it? Why is that? Why is it the vision for the city is just thrust on the people as though you take it or leave it?
Primarily because, one, systemically, there is a problem in the way the whole process has been constructed in the legal domain. So the master plan, the act itself does not allow, it's very archaic, it does not allow for participation during the plan making process. Once the plan has been prepared, we are required as planners to put it out in the public domain for definitely not participation, but comments and suggestions. So therefore, while the plan is being prepared, there is no participation, leave alone from the general public, but also from several other departments which are part and parcel of running the city. So to begin with, there is an issue with the act which defines how the plan has to be prepared. And then from that, there are several other issues that emerge from that. I'm not too sure if we have the time to answer that, but it's essentially a lot of the problem lies in the way the act has been framed. It's a very old act. With all the amendments, it still is not in line with the current requirements and current context.
You know, people like Ravi, who sort of were on this restructuring committee, could actually speak to this a little bit more. We're coming towards the end of the time that was available for this program. So I'm going to take one last question from Janvi and read that out to you. And I'm going to actually start with Chetan, because he's an old Bangalore boy like me, and say, look, the city isn't really what it used to be. Places you cycle from home to school, etc., they are now increasingly smaller parts of the city. More people live outside in the metropolitan area, but our imagination of the city is still, you know, it's whatever, it's Kalasipalem and Coxtown. Is there a problem just being able to see, as including Dasarahalli and, you know, I don't know, Kengeri and all of these places?
So, Ashwin, I unfortunately didn't get half of your question here. I did get the
I'm saying the city, and let me repeat that quickly. The city has grown a lot. It's not the city where you cycle to the school. You know, is that part of the problem, that there isn't a clear understanding of how much bigger the city is and how much it has changed?
Yeah, I think that's a very...
Even people like us who know the city well.
Yeah, I do think you're very right. We have a perception of the earlier city of Bangalore being much smaller. And the way it has grown today, it doesn't have all of those pieces of the puzzle coming together in terms of the connectivity. And it's grown in ways that have make these things much more difficult. So it needs to be almost seen as each local area of what kind of solutions you can have and how does that link to the larger part of it. Because I think earlier, a lot of your world was, 5 to 6 kilometers from where you were. You didn't go beyond that. You could get everything there. Today, that world is probably 20, 30 kilometers, or sometimes even more, which means that all of a sudden, everything we understand about transportation, mobility, planning has completely changed. And that is not coming into our perspective, or maybe a lot of the policymakers' perspective of the quantum of which has grown. And I do believe it's an important part. That it is important thing to recognize that this is a very different, more of a large metropolitan than it is, the garden city of the country.
So Rajeev, I'm going to toss this back to you, both to answer, take one thing on record and then close the program as you see appropriate. BDA's master plan identifies what they call planning districts in the city. At the end of the master plan, there's a set of planning districts that are identified. And the understanding in law is that for each of those planning districts, there should be a town planning scheme that BDA is supposed to develop to actually fulfill the mandate and vision of the master plan. But after its color-coded graffiti publication of the master plan, BDA has never, in my knowledge, BDA or any other planning agency has never actually gone and made
Yeah, let me jump in, Ashwin. Basically, these are entities.
I remember I was chief guest at the 50th anniversary of the town plan request, make a town planning scheme anywhere in the state. Sorry, go on, Rajeev.
Yeah.
Sorry, did you get that?
I'll try my best. Anyway, the issue is this. Many of these organizations were set up with different mandates and different visions originally, and they have yet to come to terms with the kinds of changes that the city is going through and the company. And but I think enlightened political leadership, enlightened engagement by citizenry will be able to bring about the kind of change that we all think we need. And again, as you point out, the city itself needs so much more coordination between these entities, because there is a different there's a different wide field, there's a different Baswangudi where I live. There's so many different ways of imagining the city, but the entities that are managing the city and are responsible for coordination, planning, execution, they are not yet on the same page. And there's a lot of work that we have to do in that direction. Shall I take it to a conclusion at this point?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I wanted to thank each and every one of you, the audience, who have come together and asked so many questions, out of which we were able to answer only a handful. It's been a very engaging set of questions out there as well that shows you how passionate our citizens are about how the city is working or not working, and how to make it work in different and more sustainable ways in the future. There's so many issues that we were able to cover, thanks to Ashwin Mahesh, who has done so much both with government and in the private sector and in sort of the non-profit sector in terms of taking these ideas of sustainable mobility forward. Chetan Maini, our pioneer in the electric car space, who's doing so much more, again, not just in Bengaluru, but in the country and across in other inspiring other cities elsewhere in the world. Anjali Mohan, who has been in the thick of things with the planning process and seen the challenges, and I'm sure will tell me offline how to help improve processes going forward. And Satya Shankaran, with whom I have shared bicycle rides, and hope to see the opportunities to ride together across the city in safer lanes. There's so many other issues that we were hoping to also cover, but time's been short. Ashwin and Sathya have been working on newer ways of ensuring bicycle lanes, for example, around lakes, of which Bengaluru has many. We wanted to talk about mobility for people who are pedestrians, how difficult it is to walk on the sidewalk, on the footpath, and or to cross the street. Mobility challenges faced by the elderly, by the people who are differently able. There's so many issues as we think about sustainable transport. Luckily, there are, even in the shared economy, more movements towards electric and hybrid and less environmentally impactful vehicles. There are two-wheelers and others. We had a session with Bounce the last time, and they and other companies are out there trying to bring in electric vehicles for last mile connectivity in the shared economy. There's just so much that we still have to do and discuss and implement in the years ahead. So thank you so much, every one of you. Thank you, Bangalore International Center. Thank you, Purpose and One India, for your support in making this webinar series so insightful and enriching. And I look forward to many more interactions like this in the future. Thank you, everybody, including people who've helped us technically with the presentation today. Good evening.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you, everyone.